Ukraine did not want war, it offered peace and agreed to a ceasefire. But Russia continues its terror, as stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. According to him, the Russian Federation is disrupting negotiations and intensifying its attacks. Almost every day there are new strikes on cities and villages. Just this week, the enemy has used more than 3,000 attack drones, over 1,000 guided aerial bombs, and nearly 50 missiles. Russia is deliberately striking at civilian and critical infrastructure. The war continues because Moscow does not want to end it, the president stated.
We are constantly strengthening our defenses, working with our partners to reinforce air defense, the Pearl program, investments in the Ukrainian defense industry, and both bilateral and multilateral formats. Putin cannot be stopped with words. Pressure is needed. The world sees that Russia responds to strength. Therefore, the world can succeed through strength. Ukraine will not give terrorists any reward for their crimes. And we count on our partners to support exactly this position. Decisive action is needed from the US, Europe, G20 and G7 countries. We need to protect life. Thank you to everyone who helps with this. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
The defense forces have struck important targets on Russian territory. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. On the night of October 19th, another strike was carried out on the Novokuybyshevsk Oil Refinery in the Samara region. Explosions and a fire were recorded. According to preliminary information, the primary oil processing units were hit. The facility is involved in meeting the needs of the Russian army, and also in various other ways. A gas production plant in the Orenburg region was also hit. According to preliminary information, one of the gas processing and purification units was damaged. In addition, a fuel and lubricants depot in temporarily occupied Berdyansk was struck. There are reports of explosions and a fire at the facility. Since the beginning of the day, 76 combat clashes have been recorded on the front line. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The most intense situations are on the Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk, and Alexandrovka directions. For more details on the situation at the front line, stay tuned.
Ukrainian artillerymen and reconnaissance strike UAV groups carried out new strikes on Russian positions in the southern Slobozhansky direction. Footage of the combat operations was shared by the soldiers of the 1st Rapid Response Brigade of the National Guard, Borovai. As a result of the coordinated actions of the fighters, at least 6 Russian occupiers were eliminated. Also in the southern Slobozhansky direction, operators from the Strix drone company, part of the 14th Army Corps of the Defense Forces, are at work. With the help of drones, they locate enemy positions and destroy them along with their personnel. In addition, with precise strikes, Ukrainian defenders managed to burn several Russian vehicles.
In addition to the points previously discussed, it is also important to consider this aspect as well. This further emphasizes the comprehensive nature of our approach and ensures that all relevant factors are taken into account. We are striving for a complete understanding and implementation, encompassing every necessary detail to achieve the desired outcome effectively and efficiently. And of course, the reps that we are now receiving through US programs, but these are different types of drones, which we neutralize by creating electronic fields wherever possible and cutting fiber optic cables in various ways for this destruction. And with fire, with these fields of fire, of course, using our drones, aviation, and other systems.
Meanwhile, in the Konstantinovka direction, the Russian army conducted assault operations in the areas of Sherbinovka, Toretsk, Pleshchevka, and Rusinoyar. In the Pokrovsk sector, Russian invaders tried to push back Ukrainian defenders from their positions near Shakove, Vladimirovka, Novoekonomishevskoye, Krasny Liman, Mirnograd, Kotlin, Udaknoye, and Novopavlovka. And in the Alexandrovsk direction, combat clashes took place near Voskresenka, Sosnovka, and Novogrigorovka.
The most important sector right now is Pokrovsk, where the enemy believes there is a foothold for an offensive. More than 115,000 enemy troops have been deployed here, and they have also brought in additional artillery, drones, and long-range weapons. They are now using the latest systems, both drones and electronic warfare equipment. With longer ranges and more powerful warheads, that's why there are intense, heated battles here. But it's not working out for them. We are also carrying out counterattacks, as you mentioned, in the Dobropilya direction. And we have conducted clearing operations in 3 enemy sectors.
Ukrainian forces destroyed a Russian army ammunition depot in the area of the Kinburn Spit, according to the Ukrainian Navy. This peninsula, located between the Black and Azov Seas, holds strategic importance as it allows control over maritime approaches to the port of Mykolaiv and key shipping routes. Control over the Kinburn Spit remains critically important for the security of Ukraine's entire southern coastline. In the Kherson direction, there is a mass exodus of Russian soldiers. According to the Atesh movement, the reasons include harsh treatment by commanders, senseless assaults, and a lack of rotation. In response, the command of the Russian troops set up checkpoints in the area of Berdyansk, began checking documents and conducting searches. Locals report that deserters sometimes seize houses and use weapons. Atesh partisans disabled a radio tower in the Berdyansk region, paralyzing the command system of the Russian occupiers. This was reported by the movement. The sabotage disrupted communications and coordination between the border service units, the engineering battalion, and the Russian National Guard, causing chaos in command and a temporary loss of control over part of the border. The enemy faced serious problems in responding to threats. Atesh emphasizes that the attack demonstrated the vulnerability of Russian troops even deep in the rear. The partisans continue to carry out targeted strikes on Russian military infrastructure. And in the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 1,000 Russian servicemen. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale aggression have exceeded 1,130,000 personnel. In addition, over the past day, 1 Russian tank, 3 armored combat vehicles, 45 artillery systems, 2 MLRS, and 126 units of enemy automotive equipment were destroyed.
Continues to intensify sanctions pressure on Russia. In Russia, production is declining, loans are becoming more expensive, while sanctions are getting tougher. This was reported by the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. The largest Russian companies have faced financial difficulties, and the government's ability to support them is almost exhausted. In September, the country's banks reduced the issuance of mortgages, and Russians' installment debt for home purchases amounts to about 1.5 trillion rubles. Russian citizens have started to cut back on shopping and purchases in stores. At the same time, the rate of spending growth has halved. Many regions are experiencing difficulties hiring staff, especially in medicine, construction, sales, logistics, and the service sector. The resumption of military conscription in Germany could serve as a deterrent signal to Russia. This was stated by the country's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, according to Spiegel. The coalition in Germany continues to discuss reforming compulsory military service. According to the minister, mobilization, which was suspended in 2011, could be reinstated immediately. Pistorius also admitted that abolishing the regional military commissariats after the suspension of conscription was a serious mistake.
If we reinstate the military draft for all men of a certain age and collect data on everyone fit for military service, this will also be noticed in Russia. In other words, this is also a deterrent factor. Boris Pistorius, Germany's defense minister.
In Munich, Germany, the airport was closed due to drone threats. This was reported by the Associated Press. According to the publication, the drones were spotted by security personnel and airport staff. The administration stated that the situation had almost no impact on passengers or the flight schedule. 3 planes were temporarily redirected, 2 of which later landed in Munich, and 1 flight was cancelled. In Sweden, European countries have been urged to switch to a wartime mode in order to defend and maintain peace. This was stated by Swedish Defense Minister Pål Jonson in an interview with the German publication R&D. He encourages European countries to prepare for possible military challenges and emphasizes the need for a shift in mindset to transition to a wartime mode for the sake of preserving peace on the continent. Johnson also noted that in Sweden, 90% of citizens support aid to Ukraine and advocate for strengthening the country's defense capabilities.
Peace is not a gift, but something we must protect every day. All across Europe, people must realize that we are driven by a shared desire to live in peace. And to preserve it, we must be ready for a possible war, both morally and militarily. Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defense, in an interview with R&D.
Russia is recruiting so-called disposable spies in Europe. This was reported by the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Since 2022, European countries have expelled several hundred Russian intelligence officers. That is why recruiters from Russia are now offering ordinary citizens one-time assignments for a reward. My colleague Victoria Chistyukina will tell you more about this.
Russian intelligence agencies have stepped up recruitment of residents of European countries. Most of these cases have been recorded in Poland and the Baltic states. 130 people in 12 European countries are suspected of working for Russia. Realizing the inevitability of their agents' failure, Moscow prefers to use so-called one-time spies. Their goal is to gather information and undermine European stability.
Russian recruiters actively use the internet, social networks, church communities, sports clubs, and mass events to find potential operatives. Such people are usually recruited only once to obtain information or carry out specific tasks in the interests of the aggressor. This is part of the Kremlin's hybrid strategy aimed at undermining the security of European countries. From a statement on the website of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service,
Moscow had to resort to such risky and unreliable methods after Russia's spy network was thoroughly dismantled in Europe. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, European intelligence services have expelled about 700 agents who were operating under the cover of Russian diplomatic missions.
the largest purges took place in Bulgaria, where 82 representatives of Russian diplomatic institutions were declared persona non grata. In Germany, 65 people were expelled, in Poland 58, in Romania 52, and in Slovakia 39. In the Netherlands and Slovenia 34 each, according to a statement on the website of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service.
Russia is ramping up its hybrid activities in Europe, and Moscow could launch a military conflict against NATO and the European Union in the coming years, according to the head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, Martin Jaeger.
The hybrid methods that Russia uses to achieve this goal have become a widespread phenomenon. The frequency of such incidents represents a new level of confrontation, a standoff in which Russia views us as an adversary and, in fact, as a warring party. Despite attempts to conceal its true intentions, Moscow is in reality seeking to test the strength of our borders. At best, Europe will maintain a cold peace, which at any moment could escalate into open confrontation. We must be prepared for a further escalation of the situation. Martin Jaeger, head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, in a comment to Bloomberg.
Hidden and direct attacks by Russian special services are being recorded in Europe with increasing frequency. Analysts are convinced that Russia is already preparing for a possible war with NATO.
Ongoing acts of sabotage by Russia and reconnaissance activities by Russian drones targeting military bases and critical infrastructure in Europe indicate that Russia has already entered Phase 0 of its campaign to prepare for a possible war with NATO, according to a report by the Institute for the Study of War.
To prevent further escalation, the alliance must limit Russia's ability to threaten Europe. The head of Germany's Ministry of Foreign Affairs is convinced.
We must always remember that Russia is interested not only in Ukraine. Russian aggression is directed against all of Europe and NATO. We hear this from Moscow quite often, and we are increasingly seeing how Russia is testing NATO's resolve. To prevent further escalation of Putin's extremely dangerous game, we must continue to limit his ability to threaten us. This includes depleting Russia's military budget.
Russia uses any means to destabilize Europe. Recently, Polish border guards discovered an underground passage beneath the Polish-Belarusian border. The tunnel started in Belarus and ended on the Polish side, about 20 meters from the border line. According to Euronews, this is the second tunnel discovered this year along the border section between the two countries. The first one was found near the border post in Narevka. It is likely that these structures are intended to help saboteurs and migrants get from Belarus into Poland. Since January 2025, Polish border service employees have documented more than 26,000 attempts at illegal border crossings.
Russia has begun implementing a new migration policy aimed at artificially changing the demographics of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. This was reported by the Center for National Resistance. The Kremlin allegedly intends to create conditions for the return of residents of Donbass, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions as well. However, instead of returning Ukrainians, what is actually happening is the resettlement of citizens from Russia's interior regions.
The Kremlin is launching a program to colonize the temporarily occupied territories. According to the new migration concept, it is mandated to create conditions for the return of residents of Donbass, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions. But the plan is not to bring back Ukrainians, but rather loyal subjects from the depths of Russia, from Yakutia to Buryatia. In fact, this is the legalization of population replacement, the displacement of locals, and the settlement of new Russians, Russification, and demographic engineering. And old colonial methods in a new wrapper.
Dictator Putin, in a phone conversation with the US president, demanded that Ukraine give up the Donetsk region as a condition for ending the war. This was reported by the Washington Post. In exchange, Putin is allegedly ready to give up the parts of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions occupied by Russia. These territorial claims are somewhat less than those he put forward in August at the summit in Anchorage. Some White House staff even saw such a statement from the dictator as progress. Trump himself has not yet publicly commented on this demand. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that Ukraine does not agree to give up either Donetsk or any other territories to the aggressor. He said this in a video address. Let's listen.
We will give nothing.
We will not give the aggressor anything, and we will not forgive them anything. We clearly see that Russia is a long-term threat, so here in Europe we need years of cooperation and real results both in the short term and in the longer term so that people can live. And one more thing, I have instructed our diplomats and have already discussed this with many leaders to prepare a meeting of the coalition of the willing in the near future. Here in Europe we need common strong positions, and this will happen.
Putin will not end the war until he gets some part of Ukraine. This was stated by Donald Trump. The US president expressed this opinion in an interview with Fox News. Trump expressed confidence that the Russian dictator will not make territorial concessions because, as the American leader put it, Putin's goal was to take something. His army has seized certain territories. At the same time, Trump also emphasized that he cannot give all his weapons to Ukraine since he believes that this would put the United States of America in danger. Putin considers the war against Ukraine his historical mission and sees himself as a new gatherer of lands, writes the Financial Times. And in order to obtain territories that the Russian army has been unable to conquer for more than 10 years, he is proposing a deal. My colleague Nikita Skoblikov will continue on this topic.
In a conversation with Donald Trump, Putin, as a condition for ending the war against Ukraine, demanded that the entire Donetsk region be handed over to Russian control. High-ranking officials reported this to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity. The Russian dictator stated that, in return, he is ready to give up the territories of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions temporarily occupied by the Russian army.
Putin has unsuccessfully tried to conquer this territory for 11 years, facing resistance from Ukrainian forces, who have deeply entrenched themselves in the area. They consider the region an important stronghold against Russia's rapid advance westward toward their capital. Putin's focus on Donetsk indicates that he is not backing down from his previous demands, which have led the conflict to a deadlock, despite Trump's optimism about reaching an agreement, as reported by the Washington Post.
The head of the Kremlin keeps repeating. The Russian army is allegedly advancing along the entire front line. He tried to convince the US president of this as well during a phone conversation on October 16th. But in Washington, they do not believe such statements. They know perfectly well that the real situation at the front is completely different.
I think there is a fundamental mismatch of expectations. I would say that this applies to Russia's war against Ukraine, where the Russians tend to believe that their actions on the battlefield are more successful than they actually are. And I think that because of this, it has become more difficult to reach an agreement under these circumstances.
Financial Times analysts are convinced that Putin does not intend to stop his aggression against Ukraine. In their opinion, the Russian dictator sincerely believes that he can win. Moreover, he is even willing to turn a blind eye to the collapse of Russia's economy. For Putin, the war against Ukraine has an ideological meaning, experts summarize.
For Putin, it's not a matter of money, it's his legacy. He wants to go down in history as the greatest Russian ruler since Peter the Great. He believed he could give Trump a victory but decided not to do so. From a Financial Times publication.
Proof that Putin is not seeking peace is his new order, which paves the way for the large-scale resettlement of Russians to territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russian army. As noted by the Center for National Resistance, this is essentially a program to replace the local population and accelerate Russification. The resettlers are being offered benefits, simplified bureaucratic procedures, and promises of assistance with housing and employment. Moscow plans to populate the Ukrainian lands occupied by Russia. with residents from impoverished Russian regions.
The Kremlin is launching a program to colonize the temporarily occupied territories. According to the new migration concept, conditions are to be created for the return of residents of Donbas, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions. But the plan is not to bring back Ukrainians but loyal subjects from the depths of Russia, from Yakutia to Buryatia. In fact, this is the legalization of population replacement, the displacement of locals, and the settlement of new Russians, Russification, demographic engineering, and old colonial methods in a new guise. From a publication by the Center for National Resistance on Telegram.
If we look at the statistics, there aren't even people now in the temporarily occupied territories who would go to work in the housing and utilities sector or even do basic jobs as drivers of route buses and trolley buses. In other words, there is a colossal shortage of personnel.
The Center for National Resistance notes, the Kremlin's new strategy in the temporarily occupied territories is an attempt to revive the old imperial model of settling Siberia, when settlers were used to consolidate the central government's power over captured lands. Now the occupiers are trying to play out the same scenario in Ukraine.